Hey, thanks for stopping by. If you decided to click on this video, you probably already have a pretty good idea of what you're about to hear. This time around, we're getting into some seriously disturbing and brutal subjects, so I should warn you right from the start that this isn't something everyone will want to listen to. Hopefully, you'll enjoy the history behind it, or at the very least, walk away having learned something you didn't know before. Back in the Middle Ages, torture wasn't just something carried out as a form of punishment. It became an officially approved method of questioning people, with the main goal of forcing confessions out of those who stood accused of crimes. Everything changed in 1252 when Pope Innocent IV, despite the irony of his name, officially gave permission for torture to be used as part of the Church's legal system. From that point on, what had once been a secretive and questionable practice became a recognized tool of justice. It was accepted by powerful institutions and used throughout Europe for centuries, during both religious and legal investigations, all under the belief that unbearable pain could reveal the truth. Today, I'm taking a closer look at that dark chapter of history to show you some of the most horrifying torture methods ever used during the Middle Ages. So get comfortable, settle in, and maybe take a second to appreciate the fact that you're only hearing about these terrible practices instead of experiencing them yourself. The thumbscrew came in all kinds of sizes and designs, but most versions were small, made of metal, and built for one horrifying purpose. A person's thumbs would be locked inside the device, and every turn of the screw tightened the pressure a little more, slowly crushing the bones and flesh until the thumbs were badly mangled or even completely torn apart. What made this instrument especially terrifying was how simple it looked. It wasn't a large or complicated machine. It was just a small tool, yet it was capable of causing an unbelievable amount of pain. If you want to get even the slightest idea of what it might have felt like, try gently squeezing one of your thumb joints between your fingers. That little bit of pressure is uncomfortable enough. Now imagine a force many times greater than anything your own hand could ever produce, with the pressure increasing little by little as someone kept turning the screw. The worst part wasn't only the physical pain, it was knowing that you had absolutely no control over when it would stop. The only person who could bring you relief was the one choosing whether to tighten the screw even more, and that feeling of complete helplessness made the experience even more unbearable. Thinking about it this way can help me understand just how cruel and inhumane devices like this really were. That said, I definitely wouldn't recommend trying to recreate the feeling for every torture method I'm going to talk about, because some of the things on this list are far too horrifying to even imagine. There were many different versions of devices built to crush a person's feet. Some were small and fairly simple, while others were much more elaborate, but every one of them was created with the exact same cruel purpose in mind. Some designs squeezed the foot from the sides, forcing the bones together until they cracked and splintered. Others worked from the top down, applying crushing pressure that broke the bones one after another. In many cases, the damage started at the heel and slowly moved toward the toes. The smaller bones were crushed first, and as the pressure continued to build, the metatarsal bones would eventually shatter as well. It wasn't meant to kill someone quickly. Instead, the entire process was carefully designed to stretch out the pain for as long as possible. One of the most infamous versions was known as the Spanish boot. This device locked the victim's lower leg and foot inside a heavy iron casing, leaving only a narrow gap between the metal and the person's leg. Torturers would then hammer wedges into that space. With every strike of the hammer, the wedges were driven farther inward, making the iron casing squeeze tighter and tighter until the bones underneath began to crack. Another variation, called the shin crusher, focused its damage on the lower leg instead of the foot. It used two curved iron plates covered with spikes, teeth, and rounded metal studs that clamped around the calf and shin. As the plates were tightened, those metal points dug deeper into the flesh while the growing pressure crushed the tibia and fibula beneath them, breaking the bones through steady, relentless force. The idea behind these devices was surprisingly straightforward, but the results were absolutely horrific. They turned a person's own skeleton into the source of unimaginable suffering, making every bit of pressure even more agonizing than the last. The breast ripper, sometimes called the iron spider, or simply the spider, is believed to have been a torture device created specifically for women. From the way it was built, it's clear that its purpose went far beyond causing physical pain. It was also meant to humiliate its victims and leave them with permanent scars that could never be hidden. Made from iron and often heated until it became red hot, the device featured 4 curved claws at its end. Those claws were fastened around one breast, and then the torturer would slowly pull with deliberate force until the flesh was ripped away. The suffering wasn't meant to happen all at once. Instead, the process was carried out gradually, making the pain even more unbearable. Its purpose wasn't limited to punishment alone. The injuries it caused were intended to remain visible for the rest of the victim's life, acting as a public reminder of what authorities claimed was her guilt. In that sense, the device was designed to destroy more than the body. It was also meant to strip away a person's dignity and leave lasting emotional as well as physical scars. Historians believe the breast ripper was sometimes used as a punishment for unmarried women, making it not only a brutal instrument of torture, but also a tool of public shame. For hundreds of years, the rack was used throughout Europe, and although it existed in several different forms, every version worked in basically the same horrifying way. The victim was forced to lie flat on the device while their wrists and ankles were tightly secured with heavy leather straps or metal cuffs. Those restraints were attached to ropes or chains that wrapped around large rollers positioned at each end of the rack. As the torturer slowly turned a crank or wheel, the ropes became tighter and tighter, pulling the person's arms and legs in opposite directions. Little by little, the body stretched beyond its natural limits. The joints were placed under unbearable strain, and eventually they began to dislocate one after another. If the process continued, the injuries became far more severe, often causing permanent damage. This brutal method of torture became known simply as being racked. In England, the rack earned the nickname the Duke of Exeter's daughter. Historians believe the name dates back to 1447, when John Holland, the second Duke of Exeter, served as Constable of the Tower of London, where the device became closely associated with his office. One of the best-known victims was Anne Askew. In 1546, at only 25 years old, she was tortured so severely on the rack that, after finally giving a confession, she could no longer stand or walk. Her shoulders, hips, elbows, and knees had all been pulled out of their sockets, forcing her to be carried to her execution in a chair. She was later burned at the stake. Some versions of the rack were made even more terrifying by adding another form of suffering. In certain cases, a fire was lit beneath the metal frame so that, while the victim's body was being stretched apart, the heat gradually increased until they were slowly roasted as well. Another variation, known as the horse, was built from wood. The prisoner was tied to a large wooden beam, while a pulley system pulled their arms and legs in opposite directions. Once the joints had been forced out of place, the victim was left hanging beneath the structure in constant agony while the interrogator continued asking questions and demanding a confession. Even the people who managed to survive these devices almost never recovered completely. Although dislocated joints could sometimes be forced back into place, the muscles, tendons, and surrounding tissue were often torn beyond repair. Many victims were left permanently disabled, living with weakness, limited movement, and chronic pain for the rest of their lives. Anyone who was subjected to this device was first tied down so tightly that moving their head or pulling away was impossible. Once the victim was completely restrained, the instrument known as the jawbreaker was forced into their mouth. After it was in position, the torturer would begin turning a screw mechanism little by little. With every turn, the metal prongs spread farther apart, forcing the mouth open beyond its natural limits. The growing pressure caused teeth to crack and splinter, while the jaw itself was stretched wider and wider. If the victim happened to be strapped down face first, that tremendous force could also travel through the neck, putting enough strain on the vertebrae to cause serious injury. The suffering didn't stop once the initial damage had been done. The jawbreaker could remain locked in place for minutes or even hours, leaving the victim trapped under constant pressure with no way to escape the pain. Every passing moment added to the agony, making the experience even more unbearable. What made this device especially cruel wasn't just the injuries it caused. It was the fact that it could keep someone suspended in that helpless condition for an extended period, unable to move, unable to find relief, and completely at the mercy of the person operating the device. One of the most brutal and visually terrifying forms of torture was known as breaking on the wheel. It became especially infamous in countries like Scotland, France, and Germany, where it was used both as a punishment and as a public display meant to intimidate everyone who witnessed it. The victim was tied to a large wooden cartwheel with their arms and legs stretched out across the spokes in a spread eagle position. Once they were secured, the executioner would carefully strike their limbs with a heavy iron bar or wooden mallet. Each blow was delivered with deliberate precision, shattering bones and crushing joints one after another. As the beating continued, the wheel itself became part of the torture. The broken arms and legs were bent around its wooden frame, twisting the victim's body into an unnatural position while every new strike caused even more devastating injuries. If the prisoner still refused to confess, the punishment became even more horrifying. Red-hot pincers were brought in to tear away pieces of flesh, adding another level of unbearable pain. Every step of the process was carefully intended to destroy not only the victim's body but also their determination to remain silent. If none of those methods produced the confession the authorities wanted, the ordeal usually came to a sudden end. The executioner would deliver the final blow by beheading the victim with an axe, bringing the gruesome spectacle to its violent conclusion. For anyone who suffers from even the slightest fear of enclosed spaces, the oubliette would have been nothing short of a living nightmare. This small, dark prison was designed to leave its occupants trapped in complete isolation, cut off from both light and the outside world. The oubliette was little more than a deep, narrow shaft made of stone, and the only way in or out was through a trap door in the ceiling. Once that heavy door closed above the prisoner, they were left in complete darkness with no hope of seeing daylight again. Its name comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. That name perfectly reflected its purpose. Anyone who refused to reveal the information their captors wanted could simply be thrown inside and forgotten, disappearing from the outside world as though they had never existed. These prisons were often called bottle dungeons because they narrowed toward the bottom. Their shape made movement almost impossible. There wasn't enough room to stand up straight, and there wasn't enough space to lie down comfortably either. The only options were to crouch or curl into a cramped position while every muscle slowly stiffened with pain. Some prisoners were left inside until they eventually died from starvation. Others endured an even slower form of suffering. Small amounts of food and water were dropped through the trap door, just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to give them any real strength or hope. Their bodies survived, but their minds gradually began to fall apart. In that endless silence and complete darkness, the passage of time lost all meaning. Long before the body finally gave out, isolation, fear, and hopelessness often destroyed the prisoner's sanity, making the oubliette as much a psychological torture chamber as a physical prison. There was nothing complicated or subtle about the torture known simply as the saw. It wasn't viewed as just another form of punishment. Instead, many authorities considered it a justified execution, one reserved for people they believed deserved an especially slow and public death. The victim was suspended upside down with their legs spread apart, and that position wasn't chosen by accident. It was carefully intended to make the suffering last as long as possible. Two executioners worked together to operate a large, two-handed saw, placing the blade at the groin before slowly cutting downward with steady, deliberate strokes. Hanging the victim upside down served a horrifying purpose. Because blood continued flowing toward the head, the person often remained conscious far longer than they normally would have. Instead of quickly passing out from blood loss, They stayed aware of what was happening as the blade moved lower through the body. In many cases, the victim didn't lose consciousness until the saw reached the chest, where the lungs and heart were located. Only at that stage did death finally arrive, bringing an end to the ordeal. Historical records show that this execution method was often inflicted on people accused of engaging in same-sex relationships. Both men and women could be sentenced to this punishment, although men appear to have been targeted much more frequently. Evidence of this brutal practice has been found throughout much of Europe, including Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and several other regions. Even more disturbing is the fact that, in some places, this form of execution continued to be used well into the 19th century. The device, known as the Judas cradle, sometimes referred to as the guided cradle or the Judas chair, looked surprisingly simple at first glance. It consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat with a sharply pointed tip, usually made from wood, although some versions were forged from metal. Despite its plain appearance, it was designed to inflict unimaginable suffering. The victim was stripped of their clothing, tightly restrained, and suspended above the pointed pyramid. Then, little by little, they were lowered until the tip pressed against one of the body's most sensitive areas. Depending on the prisoner's sex and the offense they were accused of, the point of contact was either the anus or the vagina. This wasn't simply intended to cause physical pain. It was deliberately chosen to maximize humiliation as well. The torture didn't end once the victim had been lowered onto the device. The torture could change the amount of pressure at any moment by lifting one of the prisoner's legs or raising them slightly before letting them drop back down again. Every movement sent another wave of intense pain through the body. To make the ordeal last even longer, oil was sometimes applied to the tip of the pyramid. That wasn't done out of compassion. It reduced friction so the torture could continue without interruption. In some cases, heavy weights were attached to the victim's legs, allowing gravity itself to increase the pressure and make the suffering even more severe. Prisoners were often left suspended for hours, sometimes overnight, forced to remain above or on the device while knowing the torture would continue when morning came. If they lost consciousness, the torturer simply waited for them to wake up before starting again. The device was also intentionally left uncleaned. As a result, even if the injuries themselves weren't immediately fatal, infection often became another deadly threat waiting to claim the victim. Some people died relatively quickly, while others endured the agony for many hours or even several days. The true purpose of the Judas cradle reached beyond physical injury alone. It was created to completely strip away a person's dignity, privacy, and sense of humanity. That total humiliation was every bit as important as the pain itself, which is why the Judas cradle remains one of the most infamous and disturbing torture devices associated with the Middle Ages, earning the number 2 spot on this list. At the top of this list is a device known as the crank. Even though it's sometimes described as a method of torture, the reality is that once this process began, there was no chance of survival. It was, in every sense, a slow and deliberate execution. The victim was fully conscious as they were strapped tightly to a table. Their arms and legs were secured so firmly that even the slightest movement was impossible. Once they were restrained, the executioner made a small incision in the abdomen, just large enough to reach inside the body. A hook connected to a hand-operated crank was then attached to the upper section of the intestines. From there, the executioner slowly began turning the handle. With every rotation, the mechanism pulled the intestines out through the opening a little farther, inch by inch. The victim remained awake throughout the ordeal, fully aware of what was happening, with no way to escape the pain or the horror unfolding before their eyes. As the process continued, as much as 18 feet of intestine could eventually be wrapped around the crank. Death rarely came quickly. Instead, it resulted from a combination of severe blood loss, overwhelming shock, and unimaginable pain. No one subjected to this method was expected to survive. What made it especially horrifying wasn't only the physical destruction it caused, but the fact that the condemned person was forced to witness their own death as it slowly unfolded. Looking back at the history of medieval torture, It's impossible not to recognize just how cruel and inhumane many of these practices were. At the same time, studying this dark period reminds me how important it is to appreciate the progress humanity has made over the centuries, and why we should never allow ourselves to return to methods like these. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness all the way to the end. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking with me through some incredibly disturbing history. I'd love to hear what you think, so let me know in the comments which of these torture methods you found the most terrifying. I also want to give a huge thank you to all of our top-tier supporters, whose names are on the screen right now, along with everyone who supports us through Patreon or YouTube memberships. Your support makes it possible for us to create the extra videos we release every month. We've got another video coming out in just a couple of days, and this one takes a look at the surprisingly fascinating history of medieval toilets and sanitation. As always, I also upload a brand new video every Friday, so if you've been enjoying these videos and want to learn even more about medieval history, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Thanks again for being here. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll see you in the next video.